Just be really great to see. Okay, I'll start again. It'd be really great if people could put their names in the chat and say where they're coming from, just so we can get a sense of feel where people are. If you feel comfortable doing that. So welcome to this first Resurface webinar that we're doing to just kind of introduce people to some of the concepts that are important for us at Resurface, and also just to get to know you as a community and help introduce you to everything that we're doing and hopefully continue a long-lasting relationship. So what I was going to talk to you about tonight and is really the sort of intersection between trauma, resilience, and flow. And one of the really amazing things about all of this work is actually something that I think is important to say, is that resilience can be learned. Flow is available to everyone. It's not an elusive state. It's actually available to everyone. And that trauma is curative. And I hope that those three statements there give you a sense of hope. And I want to start off just talking about what trauma is and how we see the treatment of trauma as a result of how we identify it. So trauma to us at Resurface is a type of imprint on the nervous system that results in a certain amount of symptoms that are detrimental to your current existence. So it's usually something from the past has made an imprint on your nervous system that's led to a set of symptoms in the present that are usually maladaptive, that cause distress and discomfort. And within that, there are so many different types of trauma that people talk about: intergenerational trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress, developmental trauma. There's a huge list. And I don't think it's actually that helpful to look at it that way. I think it's really helpful to look at trauma as basically coming in two forms. We have one form is a type of trauma and a set of symptoms that is the result of something that happened to you. An event is what technically we call a stressor. And that event could be a car crash, it could be an explosion, it could be a form of assault, it could be anything that is external that has really influenced and hit you hard and left this kind of psychic wound. And that requires a very different kind of treatment to the kind of treatment of the other type of trauma. And the other type of trauma is what didn't happen to you. It's the neglect, the abandonment, the developmental stages that maybe you weren't cared for and helped to go through. And we have to, if we understand trauma as coming in those two kinds of forms, we can then start to look at how we treat that. Because when something happens to you, it usually results in a form of or a set of symptoms that is commonly known as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And how do we treat that? Well, we treat that by taking away those symptoms through various techniques, therapies, and modalities. And then we have a type of trauma, developmental trauma, the neglect, the abandonment. Now, how do we take away something that's not there? We can't. It's impossible to do that. So what we have to do is we have to treat that in a very different way. We have to put something in. Technically, we call it a corrective experience. But what we're doing is we are giving people the opportunity to experience something differently from how they experienced it growing up. And just to make that concrete, or to make it more relatable, let's just say that no one ever listened to you when you're growing up. Your needs were never met. No one ever listened to you. No one ever heard what you were saying. And after a while, you gave up in saying, because it made no difference. A corrective experience may be being in a mutual support group or a therapeutic group, or even in a one-to-one session, and you're able to say what you need to say, describe a situation, and people listen, and they are silent, and then they offer supportive feedback, and you realize that what you said was heard. That would be an example of what we call a corrective experience. So when we're working with trauma, we have to really look at, are we working with something that's really happened to someone and we have to take that away? It's almost what I call the surgery. Or do we have to gently help put something into people to correct a certain set of experiences. And so usually PTSD is best treated in a one-to-one basis with a skilled clinician. And the neglect, the abandonment, the developmental issues, the deficits that people have is usually best treated in a group setting, usually with a skilled clinician too, but it doesn't have to be. So trauma is something that is curable and treatable. And as long as we know the type of trauma we're working with and what we need to do with that, we're able to look for the right solutions in the right places. And this is why on Resurface, we put a lot of emphasis on the group programs and on the group process, because we allow people through certain types of therapy, like experiential group therapy, to allow people to develop very quickly certain corrective experiences that can make massive transformative change. And then in terms of the surgery element, the treating of PTSD, this doesn't work so well in a group process. So what we tend to do in our group programs is give people the foundations to be able to do that work, the resourcing, the stabilization, the positive affect that allows people to be really robust to then go and do that work in a specialized way, usually with a one-on-one clinician. And that's kind of our philosophy around trauma and how we treat trauma and how we recommend that people treat trauma. So just to repeat, trauma comes in kind of two forms: what happens to you, and we have to treat that with a sort of almost think of it in like a medical surgical way. We take that away. And then what didn't happen to you, and with what didn't happen to you, the neglect, the abandonment, we have to put something really positive in that helps you see and reframe things differently. And that has an extremely powerful effect, particularly on people's attachment styles, attachment issues. So what's the link between trauma and resilience and flow? Well, I'm going to move into just resilience now. Resilience is a word that's bandied around a lot at the moment. Resilience really is, people talk about resilience as the capacity to bounce back, the ability to stretch without breaking, the ability to keep going, to keep carrying on, to really, even when everything is against you, to triumph, or just to, even sometimes the triumph is just to exist and manage in the moment. And all of those things that people talk about resilience and describe resilience are true and useful. But I find that the most useful way of looking at and describing resilience comes from someone called Karen Rivich from the University of Pennsylvania. And she describes resilience as the capacity or the ability to draw upon internal and external resources in a time of crisis, or in a time of need, or in a time of adversity. And that's a word that comes up a lot when people talk about resilience, is adversity, and the way you relate and the way that you respond to an adverse situation. Now, when Karen is talking about internal and external resources, I think just even from that definition, it's really useful to be able to extrapolate from that. Okay, what does she mean by an internal resource? What is an external resource? Do I have internal resources? Do I have external resources? Do I even know what they are? Can I describe them? And just asking those questions can enlighten you to, like, oh, this is where maybe I need to do a lot of the work. Because I've worked with people who have a lot of external resources and not very many internal. And a lot of people have a lot of internal resources, but not many external. And I think it's important to define or to explain what we mean by an internal resource and an external resource. Well, external resources, I think, are easier to describe. External resources could be friends, romantic partners, family members, members of mutual support groups, therapists, yoga classes, gym classes. It's anyone or anything that's external to you, outside of you and outside of your consciousness, that can really help support and motivate you to keep going. Now, that can be the experience of, I don't know, in mutual support groups, we hear people who share their experience, strength, and hope. And that can be incredibly inspiring. You can hear how someone has turned their life around, and the means of how they turn their life around can give you a certain kind of psychic energy to keep going. And that would be an example of how an external resource can really help you and motivate you to keep going. Another external resource could be a yoga class. And what did you learn in the yoga class? Well, you learned how to breathe differently, which could help self-regulate you when you're stressed and help lower some of that stress level. And there you have the experience of an external resource really helping you in the moment of when you need to draw upon what you've learned there. External resources could also be books, podcasts. Nowadays, I have to say some of the TikTok reels and some of the Instagram reels can be very valuable, very beneficial. Some of them are appallingly wrong and some of them are excellent. And it's hard to navigate that sometimes, but still there's a lot of value to be found in those kind of resources. And then we come to like internal resources. And what do you mean by internal resources? Well, this could be what we call interoceptive skills. So interoception is the capacity to notice what's going on inside your body, almost like from the skin inwards. So it could be, what temperature am I right now? How's my breathing? Am I thirsty? Am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I stressed? Am I calm? How does it feel in my knee right now? These kind of skills are amazing internal, it could be a form of internal resource that allow us to reorient ourselves, to ground ourselves, and to bring ourselves into the present. When we start to notice what's going on inside ourselves and train ourselves in interoceptors, train our interoceptive capacity, the better we get at that, the better we are able of bring ourselves out of, maybe we're obsessing about something in the future and we have to bring ourselves to the present. Maybe we're ruminating about something from the past and we want to bring ourselves back into the present. Maybe we've just had something very shocking happen and our whole kind of nervous system is firing in all sorts of different directions. And we need certain skills to bring ourselves back into the present. Well, if we don't know exactly what's going on, we can't navigate that, rectify it, and draw upon other resources to bring ourselves into the moment and to ground ourselves. That comes from developing our interoceptive skills. Now, what I'm talking about is quite abstract there. So what would be an example of a way of developing our interoceptive skills? Well, yoga, again, is an excellent resource because yoga doesn't just help you balance and stretch and develop your proprioceptive skills. It also really has a tremendous focus on breath and internal states. And one of the wonderful things about yoga is that the positions and things that you do are time framed. So you know that when you're in that uncomfortable position, it's going to be over. That I only have to learn how to endure this for 5 seconds or 5 breaths or whatever it is that is the style of that particular class. And from that, you can start to build up your resilience skills in terms of tolerance. Whereas if we think about trauma is when you don't know when something stressful is going to end. And that's not what trauma is. Traumatic symptoms often develop when we're in a situation where we know that there's no end, that we lost all control and power over what's happening. When we're developing a resilience skill in let's just say a really uncomfortable yoga pose, we get the opportunity to sit with that for a certain amount of time, and we learn that we have control over how long we stay in that, and we can come out of it at any time we like, or we can train ourselves to stay the full amount of breaths or time in that position, and we're building up certain skills there. And it's very similar to the sort of current very fashionable resilience skill of learning how to tolerate the cold water at the end of a shower. When we might start with 5 seconds and then 10 seconds, and then the next day build it up to 15 seconds, and then after a few weeks maybe we're at 5 minutes, who knows. But what we're doing there is we're building up our resilience skills, our capacity to tolerate. Those would be certain internal resources that we've developed and learned, that we can sit with something, that we have the self-esteem and the experience to be able to get through something really uncomfortable. Another example of internal resources could be an internal resource could be certain cognitive skills, the capacity to give yourself the opportunity to reframe something, to explore the full context of the situation so that we're not always catastrophizing, jumping to the worst case scenario, or maybe we're just jumping always to a helpless position. When we develop our cognitive capacity, this top-down approach is really valuable in learning to, sometimes the situation may be awful, and that is the worst case scenario is the actual true scenario. But if we don't allow ourselves to explore all the options, we will always find ourselves in kind of the catastrophic or helpless position. And that is a position to give up, usually. That's what often develops what Martin Seligman talked about, sense of learned helplessness. And when we develop resilience skills, we're giving ourselves the opportunity to not fall into that place of depression, learned helplessness. So there's another example of resilient internal resources. Breath work. My favorite form of breath work is what we call resonant or coherent breathing. There are many other internal and external resources that we can explore, and I invite you to do, hopefully having listened to that, start really looking at and bringing attention to what are my internal and external resources? How can I develop them? And that's a key part of what we do at Resurface, is to try and educate and help people learn what are my internal and external resources? Where are my deficits? How can I learn more from this? Where are the resources to expand there? And it's something that we're very passionate about. Now, flow is an integral part of everything we do at Resurface. It's actually the basis of all of the change that we're trying to facilitate, because flow is an optimal form of or state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. Athletes call it being in the zone. Jazz musicians talk about being in the pocket. Artists talk about being in flow. And they're all describing the same state. And this state of consciousness is sometimes referred to as effortless effort, but it's where we feel our best and we perform at our best. And as a result of being in flow, extraordinary things happen. McKinsey showed that productivity is enhanced by about 500%. The University of Sydney showed increases of 430% that people's creative capacity expands by about 430% when in flow. The DARPA found very similar results around problem solving. This famous Harvard study that shows that people's creativity is enhanced for about 3 days following having been in just a single flow state. So what we at Resurface are doing is we're taking that. Imagine that increase in creativity, problem solving, and productivity. We're bringing that into the therapeutic space. And that's why we use things like surfing in particular, but it's not just exclusively surfing, but that's why we take the great thing about surfing is so conducive to getting people into flow. But we take the fact that people have been in flow and get into flow, and we use that to enhance the therapeutic process. So if we're doing some one-on-one EMDR type processes with people, we're accelerating the capacity of people to make connections and reframe what's happened to them. When we're doing group work, experiential work, psychodrama, these kind of things, we're taking people having been in flow and taking that creativity, problem solving, and productivity into the therapeutic space. And people have been consistently reporting that they're able to go deeper, faster. Like people have said things like, we've been able to do in this week what took months in regular talk therapy. And it's because we're taking those amazing benefits of having been in flow, which coaches have been doing for years, but people in the therapeutic space really haven't. And we're taking that into the therapeutic space and finding dramatic results. And those dramatic results can be in helping people heal their trauma symptoms. And that can be also help people to really enhance and build up their capacity for resilience, building up their internal resources. Those internal resources can come in the form of massive improvements in self-esteem. You know, we've had people who say, oh, I'd never get in the water, I can never stand up on a surfboard, I'll never be able to catch a wave. And by the end of the week, they're doing all of those things. We're not expecting everyone to become great surfers or lifetime surfers, but what we're hoping is that they can take from that experience, I was able to do something really hard, and I was able to take that into other areas of my life. I was able to take that into my therapy. I was able to take that into my business meeting. I was able to take that into the complications in my marriage. I was able to take that into my troubles with parenting. Those are just some examples that come off the top of my head. And from that, we get these huge psychic changes in people. So I'm hoping just from this that you've got some ideas on how we can take and begin to start healing people's trauma, how we're able to start to build up people's resilience, and how flow is kind of the conduit for that for us at Resurface, how has this capacity to really help people's clarity, to build up their self-esteem, and to really go much deeper, much faster in their therapeutic journey. And so I know we haven't got a huge amount of time, so I thought what we'd do is spend the last section of this answering questions. So I invite people to ask questions. They can put it in the chat, and I'm sure people do have questions. And I find that questions actually for me is the part where I get into flow the most when I'm talking, because it's I don't know what's coming, so there's that sense of anxiety and excitement that comes from being put on the spot and challenged, and that is a crucial element of getting into flow. So I look forward to hearing what people want to ask, and also if you have questions that come up for you after this, you're like, oh damn it, I wanted to ask this, or I wasn't sure about this, and please do message us at hold on, I was going to say meeting group chat. Here we go. I'm going to put the email in the chat if people have questions that come up for them afterwards. So the first question we got here is there a specific curriculum you've designed that we might have access to? That's an excellent question, Sarah. And the truth is, yes, actually, I was working on that today. It will be coming very soon. We hope to have our first training cohort together by the end of the year. And from that, we'll be starting what we call the Resurface Academy, to really start helping teaching clinicians how they can start integrating and implementing this into their practices. And also so that people can be trained and want to come and work for us. So we're really, really excited and looking forward to launching the Academy later this year. So Laura's asking, can you experience both types of trauma, and which do you focus on first? Excellent question. Professor Felicity Zulueta at King's College says actually that you cannot develop post-traumatic stress disorder if you do not have a history of developmental trauma. So actually what we find is that you can't really have one without the other. To answer the question though, of where do we start, or what do you focus on first? It really depends on how acute the problem is when you come into the counseling room or you come into the treatment. It's like, for example, in an ideal world, you start with the earliest experiences first, and because that's where everything, and you build up from there. But sometimes you have a situation that's so acute and pressing in your life that we need to sort that out now. In exactly the same way that if someone has a chronic drinking problem and we know that they've got serious issues and that need to be sorted out with psychotherapy, we still have to treat the alcoholism and the drinking first to give ourselves an opportunity to go and do that deeper work. So it really depends on the experience of the person and what's going on for them in their life at the time. But in an ideal world, you would start with the earlier first. it says here, Charlotte's asking, do you mostly focus on the mind? Do you facilitate body work? What's your view on emotions? Wow, some great questions there. No, we focus, everything we do at Resurface comes from the fact that we're Aristotelians. We believe in Aristotle's philosophy that we're totally integrated between body and mind, that there is no real separation in many ways. We treat them kind of separately so that we can bring focus to it, but actually we're treating everything at the same time. We do facilitate body work. Actually, Christina, my partner, is she's a doctor and she's also trained in a certain type of trauma sensitive yoga called TCTSY, which is all about really bringing focus to what's going on in the body, interoceptive awareness. So yes, we facilitate a lot of body work. I forgot to say that everything we do in Resurface is evidence-based, so all our interventions are evidence-based. What's your view on emotions, Charlotte? Well, my view on emotions is, well, emotions are this extraordinary bridge between cognition and the body, and they're experienced somatically, but they come from cognitive appraisals. So my view on emotions is that all emotions are the result of prior value judgments, conclusions that we've made in the past that automatically kick in when we get into some kind of situation. So there's a knock at the door and you become really anxious because the last time there's a knock on the door, it was the police. That would be an example of an emotion and where the emotion came from. And that it's through understanding those value judgments that we can start to change our emotional responses if we think that they are detrimental or not working for us. But having a rich emotional life is something that we strive to help people get to and teach on Resurface. So someone here says, would the flow state be discovered before the surf session, or how do you find different learners' flow states? Well, that's an excellent question. When we dive into flow, one of the things to understand is that flow has certain types of triggers, universal triggers that help people get into flow. And some of these things are things like immediate feedback, non-interruption, concentration, specific targeted goals. So we would always try and set that up. The reason that surfing is such a good avenue for getting into flow is because it meets nearly all those triggers from day one. You know, there's a sense of danger, but it's mild. There's a very important what we call skills challenge balance that has to be looked at. So getting into flow, the triggers are the same. The amazing thing about flow is it feels the same no matter what activity. So the flow states I used to get into as a musician feel exactly the same as the flow states I get into surfing, which feels very similar to the flow state I get into when I'm having great conversation with someone who I really respect and learning a lot from. So it's amazing. It's my favorite state. Hannah asked, do you think it's possible to live a life free from trauma? It depends how you define trauma. When I'm talking about trauma, what I mean there is it usually comes from a very significant type of neglect or a very significant type of stressor event. And I do think you can be free from that. Often what people mean by that is it possible to live a life free from distress or sadness or heartache? Or we could go on a while there. And I think no, and that's why it's important to develop resilience skills so that we can cope with those adverse situations in life and those challenges. Someone is here, when is the next surf program that people can get involved with? Our next one is actually a resilience and flow program that starts on the 18th of November. Details are on our website. I'm just going to try because I was meant to do a hard stop at 6:30, so I've just gone over that. So I'm just going to try and race through the last couple of questions. Could we collaborate and bring our community members to one of your retreats? Please do get in touch with us. We'd be very happy to discuss options. Yeah, that would be fantastic to get a conversation going there. Thank you for asking, Katie. Anna's asking 3 tips for people navigating anxiety. Wow. Well, the first tip is if we want to try and help the anxiety, well, something that's really helped me recently is learning about and using binaural beats. I found they're really interesting. Check them out on Spotify. I found them really useful. Breath work. So I invite you to Google the what's known as the physiological sigh that Andrew Huberman's made very well known or very popular. I think that's the best anxiety tool I know about. And then the third thing I would say is we always want to look at what's the cause of my anxiety. All emotions have causes. They're not causeless events. So being able to, we might have to do that with a therapist or any, if you're good at introspecting, but those would be my three things I'd say right now. Someone says here, Megan says, do you agree with the statement, trauma wasn't your fault, but your healing is your responsibility? Would you say that there is trauma that's self-inflicted? Well, I'd say that there's plenty of traumatic symptoms that result from things that aren't your fault, and there are some that can be from your fault. So there's context. I would say that healing is your responsibility because you're really the only person who can do it. We are all individuals in terms of our consciousness. So we're the only people who can. So it often is my responsibility. So I just want to thank you all so much for coming today. It's been an amazing turnout. We're very honored to have so many of you here. Please can you repeat the name of the person for the breathwork? Yeah, Professor Andrew Huberman. Check him out. He's all over Google, but you'll find, and over YouTube and everything, but you'll find that. So one thing we want to say is after this, thanks for putting that in there, Hannah, Andrew Huberman, exactly. After this, Lily from our team will be emailing to schedule a follow-up call for those who are interested or who'd like to get to know more. So please don't be surprised if you get contacted by Lily. And if you have any further questions, as I said, please email us. Really look forward to hearing and reading your questions, and look forward to seeing you on further webinars, workshops. Really great to have you here. Thanks very much.